How are you all doing? Good. Yeah, you're very good to be in here, although there is the odd shower passing outside, so it mightn't be any harm to be in here. It's a privilege to be here. It's so beautiful. We got a tour this morning around the island. Mairead, I don't know if she's here, did a super job showing us around. Maybe for those of you who don't know me, I'm actually a Cork man. I was born in Cork in 1970 and grew up in a very different Ireland to the Ireland we have now. There was never any money for anything, and times were tough a lot of the time. And times are tough now, but it was a lot more basic back then. And at a young age, I got the entrepreneurial bug. I guess the entrepreneurial thing was an opportunity to escape, as well. And so at a young age, I set up my first company. I sold it when I was 20. I always loved technology. I used to write code in my bedroom and then wonder why it never worked, which is the story of my life. And set up a technology company that became, I guess, quite big by Irish standards, 170 people. Sold that when I was 28. And then I set up another technology company, had the entrepreneurial bug in London. That became quite big. We grew it from 8 people to 2,500 people. And we sold that in 2008 for about $500 million. So somewhere along the way in the 2000s, I'd heard a lot about climate change. I had young children at the time. And so I got, I guess, interested and addicted to it and learned that it was very, very serious. And so when we exited Inspired, which was the company we had, when you have the entrepreneurial bug, you wait about 5 minutes and then you start your next one. My wife says that it's like being a chain smoker. You already have the next one kind of up and running. And so because we knew a lot about climate, we set up Cool Planet in 2012 to solve climate change or to help solve climate change. And today, Cool Planet operates in about 23 countries around the world, headquartered in Wicklow. And we're very lucky to work in one of these sectors where the wind is at our back, and so it grows about 1.5 times bigger every year. So I guess background tech entrepreneur with that little hint of green, and so it's lovely to be here, particularly in this building, because it's the heart of where we learn to communicate. I guess what this building represents is we learned to communicate faster because we had learned to communicate before then. And in fact, 1,000 years before this building, people got on boats, went out to that rock out there, and they gathered there, and their job out there was to protect knowledge and to document knowledge, right? And so communication has been around here for a very, very long time. And we would look at what they were doing out there as kind of quite rudimentary and quite basic. But actually for the time, that was technology, right? It was writing things down. And it's interesting when you Google Skellig Michael, they talk about their purpose was to encode, communicate, and protect wisdom, right? Which is a very nice and interesting thing, particularly to communicate a bit of it, right? And then if you go back even further on Skellig Michael, the first talk of Skellig Michael was, again, another 2,000 years before then in the Irish Annals, and it was the Tua De Donnan, who were, when you look at who they were like a mythical version of the Avengers, right? And one of the things that happened in Skellig Michael or around it was that they used magic to protect against the Spanish invaders, right? And even though we look at that and we kind of go, Irish version of the Avengers using magic to protect against Spanish invaders, you kind of go made up rubbish. But what you find about these things is that something kind of happened back then that caused that story to be written. So it's not, you dismiss most of it, but you don't dismiss all of it. Something happened, some people got together, and something happened. And so there's a very long history. And if you hang around Valentia and you look at Skellig Michael, you get a sense of a very long history of the magical and the mythical. And this cable station is just a manifestation of a modern manifestation of that. So lots of people over history playing with the technology they had at the time, right, is what's happening here. And that gives us a clue maybe as well to think about our future, right, that past. So when I read the story first, after Leonard asked me to do it, I'd been here like a couple of times, but I hadn't really picked up on exactly the cable station. I knew what had happened, but I didn't know exactly how. And it's interesting when you look at it as an entrepreneur, you look at it and you go, my God, like they barely had the technology to do this. In fact, they didn't, as it turned out. They had like copper, this funky rubber type thing as an insulation, and some iron and some ships, right? And it's very important as an entrepreneur or anybody in business to remember that's all they had, right? So think about the business pitch, right? The business pitch is, here's the crack, lads, right? You have money. What we're going to do is we're going to take this copper, we're going to wrap it in some iron and some funky rubber stuff that we found somewhere, and then we're going to run it across the Atlantic, right? And then somebody on the other side is going to pick up a signal, and we're going to make some money out of it, right? Now, we all here make decisions around business, be it big or small, right? And so if somebody pitched that to you, you just go, what? Like, what form of madness is this, right? And yet they had the bravery to do it. And more importantly, they had the tenacity to do it, right? They were like, it's a typical business story, actually. It was, we're gonna give it a go. It didn't work, right? Then they tried it again. It didn't work again. Then there was a refinancing. There's always a refinancing. And then they eventually got it going, right? It is the story as old as time of business, right? And it really struck me recently. Myself and my wife are hiking in France, and we hadn't done it before. And you're there under Mont Blanc, and you're looking at these cable cars just disappearing up into the clouds. And there's a curiosity about who was the first person to do this, right? Who was, and what was their thought, right? And when you read the history of it, they started off in 1904. They were looking up at the mountain going, you know, we should put a cable car to the top of this thing, right? But they had no technology to do that, right? And no money. And you have to admire the human spirit that just does that. It's like, we have no technology to do this, no cash, but you know what would be a great idea is to run some cables up to the top of that thing and see would it be okay, right? And over 30 or 40 years, they achieved that, right? And again, it's that absolute tenacity. Derek, if he's here, he was at the dinner last night and he was saying to me about when the cable cracked, like I think it was 600 miles, was it 600 miles out or 600 miles from where they were hoping to achieve it, the cable cracked and it just disappeared and that was it. And there was no GPS, there was no nothing. So the cable, all the money they'd spent, all the effort, it was just in the bottom of the ocean. And then a couple of years later, they couldn't dive. So a couple of years later, they just went out in a boat or several boats and they threw ropes over the edge and tried to hook it. Right? And they spent a month doing that. So they hadn't a clue where this cable was. They just threw ropes in and hooks and eventually they got it. Right? And again, the tenacity to do that. It's kind of like the entrepreneurial journey is like audacity to be brave enough to do it, and then the tenacity to keep at it. And a very old friend of mine has a great phrase about business. He says, You got to be stupid enough to get into it and smart enough to get out of it, right? And that cable is a great example of that. So as an entrepreneur, it's very humbling to be here because you know that that's the kind of thing that they had to go through, and they had to go through it numerous years, and dog's abuse from the people who are funding them, and keep at it and keep grinding it out. And so when we link that back to the story from here, and you link it to the Irish people, you think about Ireland's role in doing that. And being really blunt, we could glorify the role, right? But our role as Irish people in the laying of that cable, we were a bit part in that movie, right? We were the help and the sidekicks, right? We didn't put the money in. We didn't think it up. We were the help, right? That was our role, right? And we were an enabler. And the reason why we were that was because the history of Ireland is we were too small, we were too poor, we were too oppressed, right, to be ambitious leaders, right? That was not our role, right? We were too small, there was too much going on over our heads, if you like. So we were the followers, right? And when you look at our role today, we've done very well as followers. Depending on which number you believe, we're either the second GDP per head, right, or the 10th, right? So depending on which way you fiddle the numbers, richest country in the world. I'm going to say that again. Depending on which number you believe, we are either the second or the 10th richest country in the world, right? Now, when I say that to you, how are you feeling? Because most people I say that to go, bullshit, right? Because we're just Irish, right? So I'll say it again. Economically and financially, you can't argue with the fact that we are either the second or the 10th richest country in the world as Irish people. Yeah. So we'll come back to that. So when we then as Irish people look to the future now, right, you have to base looking to the future with a solid foundation, right? And about 10 years ago, I started meditating, right? Like the hippie who does business, right? And when the meditating guys, and I treat hippies and spiritual people with a certain amount of cynicism, but also with a certain amount of respect. When they teach meditation, they go, when you are looking at something, or if you are looking forward, right, who is looking? Right? And you go, well, it's me, right? And you go, well, who's you? Is it your hands, your legs, your ears, your brain? Like, who is looking, right? And so when we now look forward into the future as Irish people, who is looking, right? And that simple question has never been so difficult to answer, because according to the OECD, 17% of Irish people right now weren't born here, right? So who is looking, right, as Irish people? Yeah. And that's a pretty tricky question, right? According to the CSO, we're operating in 22 languages right now. And as much as that change, and that statistic, by the way, 17% is the Republic, right? If you look at the demographics of Northern Ireland, more, I guess, Catholics, possibly more Republicans, then you can if you draw a line on a graph, you say, well, maybe the Republic gets bigger, right? And I don't know, am I pro or con that, right, as an Irish person? Let's see what happens, right? But if you assume that will happen, I do deal in numbers. If you assume the trend line continues, we will have Northern Ireland. So then, if we're looking out, who is looking out at that point? Because then we are the Republic with 17% of people not born here, and Northern Ireland, who we know have a very different worldview a lot of the time to us. So who are we as Irish people at that point, right? Now, fortunately, It's a big question. Fortunately, people before us have answered this question, right? So I had a meeting about 7 or 8 months ago with Joe Schmidt, a modern deity in Ireland, who, former head coach of the Irish rugby team. And interestingly, and I never thought about this until he talked to me, he has this job, right, all the time. He has to take a bunch of people, very, very talented people, and he has to get them to play for Ireland. And you might look at that first and say, that's quite an easy job, actually, because the talent to get to the top tier of Irish rugby, you have to be very motivated and very talented. So if you're a coach, you could just say, this is kind of simple because I've just got a monster talent pool and I just got to pick the best ones and throw them out in the field. But you've got to get them to play as Irish people, right? Because you might say, well, they get paid enough to do it, but they don't get paid enough to put their bodies through what they do, right? So you have to get them to play as Irish people. And you might say, sure, that's no problem. Johnny Sexton is Irish as the day is long. But what about CJ Stander, right? What about James Lowe, right? These people weren't born here. They don't have our history, right? So how do you get them to look with Irish eyes? And you've seen them play. You've seen them at the national anthem crying their eyes out. They play as Irish people, right? And what Joe has done over 10 or 15 years, and the previous coaches before him as well, and Andy has done it, is they curate a situation where people start to understand what a modern Irish person is. And then they get them to fight like modern Irish people. And they put a lot of energy and work into that. And now, with Ireland, with 17% not born here, and with Northern Ireland, we have a role to do that as well, right? We have to get us to look through Irish eyes and to operate like Irish people. And when you do that in 2023, you end up with a very blunt question, which is, who the hell are we, right, as Irish people now? So regardless of how we look at the future, one of the first things we have to do is think about what foundation are we looking forward with? Whose eyes are we looking forward through? Yeah. So the next thing when you look forward is, okay, what are we going to do then? So we've done well up until now. There's a lot wrong, but we've done well. Right? So what is this future that we're going to create, right? Curiously, the answer is very easy, right? It's getting there is much harder. And you might say, well, if the answer is so easy about what we're going to do, what is it, right? Well, the world is getting warmer. Right? Mightn't seem like it today. It seems like a typical Irish day. But the world is getting warmer. And if you see the latest numbers, and if you haven't seen this, it was going around social media there a while ago, look at North Atlantic sea temperatures, right? And there's graphs, and the graphs are since 1980. And so there's miles of lines, right? And the graph is showing you the difference from the mean. So what is above average? And it's a typical climate graph, right? It goes up every year, right? So the North Atlantic Sea is getting hotter and hotter and hotter, right? And then, of course, typically with these climate graphs as well, if you go 20, 21, 22, 20, the numbers are higher again. So it's getting worse every year. So you'd go, we should be worried about this, right? But if you look at 2023, the graph goes nuts, right? Every year is higher, and then this year, it just goes up. It doesn't go along higher than last year. It just takes a left turn and goes straight up. And I saw it about 2 months ago, and I made a joke to somebody in the office. I said, geez, I hope this stops, right? I hope it goes up, and then at some point it'll go over. And then a couple of weeks later, they showed it to me again, and it had kept going up, right? And the bad news is, for sea temperatures, we're not at the hottest part of the year at all yet. So clearly this is bad, right? And getting worse. The very important thing, and there's a lot of bullshit in the media about climate change, sadly, journalists write about a lot of the stuff that doesn't solve the problem. It just kind of exacerbates it, and they're right about it because it's kind of controversial. Let me tell you, as somebody who's deep into business, we humans have the ability to solve climate change in the next 20 years. We have the technology, we have the money, right? They're not the things that are missing in sorting this problem. And because I'm up here, you have to trust that what I'm saying is true. But if you want, I'm very happy to talk about it. As my wife will tell you, it's one of my favorite subjects. So we have the ability to do this. Then, if fixing a serious problem doesn't get you going, let me tell you about the money side of it, right? According to the International Energy Agency, by 2030, we will be spending $4 trillion a year on climate change and the solving of it, right? And if you think that's a kind of slightly bullshit number, we're spending 1.7 trillion today in solving it, right? So this is the kind of thing you don't hear sometimes in the news, but those are the actual numbers, right? To give you an idea about $4 trillion, apart from it being a lot of money, $4 trillion puts it as the biggest sector in the world. Bigger than tech, which is currently the biggest sector, bigger than medicine, which it already is, bigger than any other sector. So if we're going to get up in the morning and put our boots on, we better do this green stuff, right? Because that's where a lot of the money is going to be. And we've been pretty good in Ireland at capturing opportunities, right? Particularly technology and everything to do with it. Yeah. So if we're gonna do it again, it's going to be the green stuff, right? So you have to forget a lot of the bullshit about Eamon Ryan and bicycles and a lot of the stupid stories that are in the media. Look at the money, right? Because that's what the money is saying, right? So let me be clear on that before I move on. This green thing is the largest wealth creation opportunity in the history of mankind, full stop, right? Lots of data around that. In Ireland, the space, by the way, is called green tech, right? For obvious reasons. In Ireland, we have the largest repository of renewable energy just out there, right? Largest repository of wind and renewables just sits out there. Right? So when you think about our assets, it's like the Saudis. When the Saudis started with oil was a pain in the ass. They were looking for water, and they couldn't get the water because there was so much of this black stuff coming up out of the ground. Right? That's the truth. That's the history. Right? Look at us. Right? We're there. The feckin' wind. Right? Right? It's in the way of trying to sunbathe. Right? But wind is without a shadow of a doubt the new oil. It's $4 trillion, right? So, and tech, according to Bloomberg, we're the 13th most technologically advanced country in the world, right? To be honest, I was surprised it wasn't top 3 or 4, right? And maybe there's some fiddling in the numbers, right? So we can lead. You know what I was saying about the cable? We didn't lead the cable thing, right? But we can lead this one, right? But are we leading it? Right? And we're not, right? Because when we look in the mirror as Irish people, we don't see leaders, right? We see something like John Wayne back in The Quiet Man. We see we're good crack, right? And we're great to have a pint of Guinness with, and we're slight chancers and rogues, right? That's what we think when we look in the mirror. We don't think about leaders. And I know that because I laboured earlier about the second wealthiest country in the world. And the reason I did that is because we have the second largest GDP per head. But then we go, yeah, but sure, that's Google, right? We have the best horse breeders in the world. Yeah, but sure we don't, right? We have the best rugby team in the world. And every person you say that to, for now, like, you know, it's been about a year, right? And I can tell you, I talk to a lot of Kiwis, they're shitting themselves, right? And they may win, and the South Africans may win, right? but I can tell you, we've got their attention now, right? So our perception of ourselves, our perception of our potential is not keeping up with the pace of the opportunity that we have, right? We look in the mirror and we don't see the thing that's the same as the opportunity. We haven't fully evolved. We don't realize that we are now the leaders and we need to lead. Us Irish, right? We don't get that message, and we need to get that message. We need to start believing. And sadly, in 2023, it's not a great time for believers, right? Because we have that technology that started in this room with copper and iron has led to the technology we have today with social media, where it's so easy to bring believers down, right? And so it's not a great, if the entrepreneurs who started this were there now and they put out a tweet, right? They said, great news, we're going to do a cable, right, across from Canada to here, right? And then you scroll down to the comments, right? Johnny from Nace would have some smart aleck remark about it, right? Oh, I'm sorry about that. I had to pick a county. Of all the counties. Leo's from Kildare. So we can show the world, and we have shown the world in the last 30 years, that we can move at extraordinary pace, right? And we have to stop doing this but yeah thing, right? And not listen to those millions of voices, you know, Johnny from Kildare. According to a survey here on social change, 70% of people in Ireland believe that social media is the biggest cause of division in this country, right? In the US, that number is 80%. 80% of people believe social media is the biggest force for division, right? If you look at the US now, and those of you, and I spend a good bit of time in the US, what the hell has happened? Like, this is the country of JFK and man on the moon, right? And now all every Yank wants to know is which side the other person's on, right? And if we're not careful, we will do the same thing. And there's perfectly good reasons and excuses we could make. You're sure 17% of people weren't born here, and then there's Northern Ireland. No, right? We're Irish. We have done this thing up until now. We have played it really well. We need to keep playing it well. And so then the question is, if we can get over that division, how do we get over that division? Because, and a lot of people don't believe this, we have the money, we have the wind, right? We have the tech, right? So how do we get over this division thing, right? And the answer to that might come from a very strange place, right? And I've been asking this question for about 18 months. And then about 6 months ago, or less, the answer came to me. And it came from a very strange place. I was watching Ireland play Scotland, and 3/4 of the way through the match, it was a vicious match, 3/4 of the way through the match, Gary Ringrose got injured, and everybody stopped. And then you looked at the scene, right, either on television or there. The Scottish team were on the ground, sucking in air, understandably, right? Because the game has another 15 or 20 minutes to go, and you're just trying to get oxygen into your lungs. And then you looked across at the Irish team, and you were expecting them to be the same, and they were all standing together in a circle. And if you looked a bit closer, they were all breathing together, right? They were doing what's called breath work, right? And they do breath work to align mentally, right? You know where they started to do breath work first, one of the first places? in that rock over there a couple of thousand years ago. Yeah. Because they knew something, right? They were not only encoding and communicating and protecting, but they also knew about this thing that they could come together, they could pray, and I'm not religious, by the way. They could pray and they could connect. And there's the Irish team, 3,000 years later, standing in the Aviva doing exactly the same thing, right? And they went on to win 29-10. So another clue for how we might not be as divisive was I was reading the Bono book, Surrender, at Christmas. If you get a chance, the best way to experience it is the Audible version, because they did a super job on it. And Bono is talking, Ireland has a very funny view of Bono. Is he a saint or a sinner, right? And Bono, years ago, when Gay Byrne, God rest him, was alive on the Late Late, he told a hilarious story about the Irish psyche. He said, the Americans, and by the way, I don't fully agree with this, but it's a good yarn. The Americans look at the guy with the house on the hill and they go, someday I'm going to be like him, right? And Bono said, the Irish look at the guy with the house on the hill and they go, someday I'm going to get that fecker. And so, by the way, I don't think that psyche or that representation is entirely true. But if you think back to us being Irish, and something Bono said in the book, he said, he was talking about doing all the work for AIDS, right? And doing all the do-gooder work. And we look at Bono and we have this kind of cynical view of him, We kind of go, is he a saint or a sinner? And we can never make up our minds. And there's this hugely impactful story he tells in the book. He said, the reason I was wandering around halls of Congress in the US convincing them to do stuff for AIDS was fear, right? And you're kind of go, well, what was the fear about? And he said, well, I went down to an AIDS hospital in Malawi, and the nun was running the hospital, this saintly Irish nun, and I genuinely mean saintly, and she was saving lives and putting her life at risk. And she sat with Bono and she told him to fix it, right? And so Bono is just doing what we've been doing for hundreds and thousands of years, which is we're just doing what the nuns told us to do. But in those thousands of years, we had a technology. We knew how to preach. We knew how to connect, right? The Irish, if you see nuns in a movie and priests in a movie, in a missionary, the typecast is they're Irish, right? And so that is a technology that we have. We understand how to communicate, and we understand how to convince, and we understand at a spiritual level how to connect with each other. And maybe within that, there is something around this division. And so, but for the last 30 years, we have forgotten that because of Catholic scandals and babies being buried and all this kind of stuff. And I'm not talking about resurrecting that. I'm talking about not forgetting what happened out there and the thousands of years of learning and connection, because almost the opposite of snide remarks on Twitter is us being able to connect with each other and being able to use that foundation, that basic connection, and to use that to go on and create something great. So, not bringing back that kind of repressed Catholic thing, but actually, similarly with technology, we figure out what the best part of that is. So let's figure out the best part of that last 1,000 years and bring that into who we are as Irish people. So, in summary, we have to create a new brand of who Ireland is now and what it means for us to be Irish. And I thought rugby is an interesting one because it brings together these ancient technologies with brand new technologies, right? And it makes us number one in the world. Yeah. And we have created that brand in the past. The Gaelic League created it over 100 years ago. They created something that at the time we understood what it meant to be Irish, right? RTE, for all their recent failings, for 80 years, they brought us together as Irish people. And every event that happened, be it sad or happy, they were there, right? And sadly now, I think they've forgotten, yeah? And maybe that's all about our distractions and their distractions. But we have done this in the past several times. We have come together and created a new brand of what it means to be Irish. So we have to do that, right? We are amazing storytellers here, right? We really are, right? You only realize that when you see how shit other people are at telling stories, right? And also, in the last 30 years, we have amassed some of the most talented entrepreneurs, right? With that ability to tell stories, yeah? And so I have a controversial point, which is I think our government is great, right? And so one of the things we need to do is we need to do what Elon Musk has done and take all our technology, all our resources, and with that entrepreneurial thing that got that cable into this building, that tenacity, right? And we have to pool all that entrepreneurial skill together and create multiple trillions in wealth, enough for the next 10 generations of Irish people, right? And that's, if you think that's a bullshit dream, have a look at the valuation of the company that we run, right? Like, spoiler alert, it's going up and to the right, yeah? So amassing entrepreneurs together, the stakes couldn't be higher, right? Getting entrepreneurs together, a big goal, financial, and also the stakes of saving humanity couldn't be higher. And the risks are incredibly high. But that's absolute fodder for entrepreneurs. That's the love. A risky situation, impossible goal, we're in. Sign us up. Yeah. And then we in Ireland waste half of all the energy that we import into this country. If you think that's an exaggeration, it's actually closer to 70%. I'm just being nice, right? We waste between 50 and 70% of all the energy we consume. We need to very quickly stop that from happening. It's silly, it's dangerous for the planet, and when we do stop it from happening, we will become a global leader in this space that we're not at the moment. And finally, we need to remember those roots I talked about. We as Irish people, and I really admire this about us, we've embraced modernity. We've embraced complexity, right? We're very good at that. But now we need to remember that rock out there in the 7th century, and we need to pick up the technologies that they had. And I'm not talking about remembering and bringing in the good old days. They understood things back then that we're only starting to figure out now. Quantum mechanics, plant medicines, right? They had access to all those technologies. They didn't know what they were called, but they had access to them. But they had something that we're losing. They had peace of mind, and we're losing it. So perhaps in rediscovering all that ancient wisdom and all those ancient technologies, we can then create a common vision and a common purpose, and also a brighter, greener future to go along with that. Thank you.